And so Freud also used the term defense mechanism, we've heard this term before too, in describing our personality. Basically, these are a set of mechanisms that our ego has used to keep our id at bay. How is it that we don't recognize these awful, awful kind of sexual impulses within us? Is all done by defense mechanisms. So I'll go through a couple of them, if not all of them, and this is the kind of strategies our mind uses. The first one is repression. So this idea that if something so horrible happens to us, we kind of push it back to the back of our memory, and we don't remember it. So the classic example is if as a child, you experienced something really tragic, like you were raped, or you saw a violent crime, someone get stabbed. And it's kind of hard for us to kind of live with that kind of memory, right? So one way to help us move on is for that part of the memory to be recessed and pushed back, and we don't remember it anymore. The idea of repression, repressed memory comes from Freud. His basic idea is that our mind sometimes needs to forget things in order for us to function properly. There's the idea of regression, which is that we sometimes have to regress ourselves back to a childish behavior in order to control our impulses. So something like sucking our thumbs, curling up in a fetal position. These are classic ways of using that kind of behavior to act like a child, to relive that time, and kind of avoid dealing with kind of modern issues. So something like when someone is really stressed, they like to smoke cigarettes. That would be a kind of regression because the cigarette smoking replicates sucking the mother's nipples, for example, which brings you back to a more childlike sensation. More obvious would be like if you curl up into a fetal position, into a ball, that represents like the kind of position you were in your mother's womb, and that's kind of a safe space, right? So people kind of use regression. Reaction formation is the interesting one. Reaction formation is when people develop the opposite kind of conscious experience than their internal experience. So they believe in one thing, but they act the opposite of it. So I'll give you a couple examples. The most famous one is the homosexual kind of impulse, that people sometimes repress their homosexual feelings and they develop the opposite of that. So they'll develop strong anti-gay feelings, right? The homophobic sensations. So they say, well, I can't be gay because I hate gays so much. And yet there's a lot of these famous stories where politicians who are anti-gay have been caught in kind of gay sex scandals. It doesn't have to be that dramatic though. There's other reaction formations. For example, if you secretly hate someone but you can't hate them, you can't hate your father, right? Because of your parental units. So one way you might do is develop the opposite one, which is like you super love your father and you overcompensate to show that you love your father, right? And this happens all the time, right? You kind of dislike someone and you go out of your way to act really nice to them. So that's reaction formation, is when you develop the opposite kind of reaction to something that you secretly feel love to. So for example, you really like to eat. You just love eating, but then you develop this abject fear, abject hatred of eating because you don't want to indulge in that. That's reaction formation. Projection is another interesting one. Projection is when we take our own internal id kind of ideas, id impulses, and project them onto someone else. You think someone else has them, but not us. So projection would be that if you have for example, a classic one would be if you and your boyfriend or your girlfriend aren't doing so well, and you're kind of really afraid of that the relationship is failing, you might project that the other person wants to break up with you, or that. So how does it go? So if you want to break up with someone, you might don't want to admit that because that's hurtful, right? So you always have this idea that, oh, maybe they want to break up with me. So you ask them, oh, honey, do you want to break up with me? Are you happy with this relationship? Right? So you're projecting your own ideas onto other people. So what's another one? Projection might be, for example, that you secretly have racist tendencies, that you kind of hate certain races like black people. And instead of admitting those, you project that onto another group. Like, no, I'm not racist. It's the black people who are racist against whites. So you're really projecting your racist feelings onto other people, right? So that's a safe way of expressing it in that, because you don't have to admit that you have it, but you could admit other people have that. Rationalization is the using logic and explanations and thoughts to justify your irrational behavior. So for example, if you want to drink as an underage minor, you know that's wrong, right? But how would you could rationalize it? Well, there's no reason children can't drink. Adults drink all the time. It's really their fault for leaving alcohol so readily available and for the media to kind of glamorize drinking. And plus it's a lot of fun. And all my friends are doing it. So either way, we come up with ideas and reasons to justify our kind of illegal impulses. That's rationalization. Displacement is, oh, I'm blanking all of a sudden, is when you place your unwanted kind of tendencies onto another body. Let me just refer to this to make sure I got that right. Yes. It's the diversion of sexual aggressive impulses onto other targets that are more acceptable. So here's an example here is that children who fear expressing anger against their parents may displace it onto kicking a pet. So really your anger and sexual target is something unattainable. You can't have sex with your mother. You can't kill your father. So these impulses are kind of placed onto something safer targets. For example, you can kick the cat, right? You can like a girl that reminds you of your mother. So you displace these unnatural feelings onto targets that are more natural. An example of that would be kind of like scapegoating, where if you're unemployed and you just lost your job and you're angry, and for some you might think that, well, maybe it's because I'm not a very good worker that leads me to do this, right? And that's kind of like, that's a dangerous kind of idea to kind of follow up on, right? So one thing is that you displace it onto other people. You place the blame onto another group. For example, like, oh, it's all those minorities. The illegal immigrants are taking our jobs. It's not that I'm a bad worker. It's really them. So you displace that feeling. Sublimation is when you take that kind of energy, that destructive or sexual energy, and channel it into something that's positive and useful. So a classic example would be like, you're so sexually frustrated, you use that time to play the piano or play the xylophone, or you build monuments shaped like giant monuments. That's kind of sexual, or paint, or something like that. So sublimating your sexual tension is to channel your sexual energy onto more kind of constructive purposes, socially acceptable purposes. And finally, there's denial, which is the straight up denial that you have these impulses at all. So you don't even believe it. You don't entertain the idea that you have these thoughts at all. It's kind of like repression, except this is with your attitudes. That if I ask you, if Freud would say, well, do you have like a natural attraction with your mother? You say, no, never. That's unthinkable. How dare you suggest that? And that's all in denial, is that you don't even entertain the idea that you have those kind of thoughts and ideas. So it's basically these defense mechanisms that create your personality, right? The different variations of these.